Hi everyone, thank you for joining and welcome to our next IAQM webinar, the Non-Road Mobile Machinery Low Emission Zone. In 2014, the Mayor of London introduced bold new emission standards for non-road mobile machinery used on construction and demolition sites. This webinar will be describing how the London Borough of Merton has managed this project and explore their key areas of learning. Today, we're going to be joined by Andrew Gordon, who's working on the NRMM project at the London Borough of Merton, Richmond and Wandsworth. He has a wide background in policy implementation, travel demand management, behavioural change and enforced work, and has been involved in the NRMM regulation since 2016. We will also be joined by Lewis Bassett, who is project coordinator for air quality projects at the London Borough of Merton, Richmond and Wandsworth. After graduating with a degree in environmental health, Lewis has worked in several areas of environmental protection, including noise, statutory nuisance, contaminated land and air quality. He has been involved with the NRMM project since it began in 2016, leading on the emission saving modelling and technical guidance, as well as carrying out NRMM inspections for 5 boroughs. And our final speaker who will be speaking today is Jason Andrews, who's overseen the portfolio for AQ projects within the Regulatory Service Partnership, with a special interest in innovative, practical and multi-agency approaches. He's been involved in the air quality sector for almost 26 years. As always, there's going to be a chance for questions at the end of the presentations, so please do submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of the screen at any point during the presentation, and I'll look them over. Thank you for logging on, and I'm going to hand over to our speakers now.
Thank you for that. I think I'll kick off here. I'm realising I've been working in local authority for 26 years. It actually makes me feel quite old. I think I should have lied about that one. I just wanted to provide a brief introduction and an outline to the project before handing over to Lewis and Andrew to cover some of the more technical aspects. And probably outline some of the really incredible outcomes that we've seen from the project in terms of emission savings and the way we've shaped the London construction fleet over the past sort of 5 or 6 years. The project was initially conceived in 2014 when there was recognised an impact from non-road mobile machinery. When we talk about NRMM, we are talking about site, plant and equipment and basically engines. And there was a desire to tackle this. This is something that's been largely unregulated throughout the UK, and in many cities it's still the case. The GLA looked towards a planning agenda to try and tackle this, but were reliant on local authorities to deliver the project locally and as part of their planning and environmental obligations. The Regulatory Services Partnership in Merton initially took up the challenge and was delivering the project for the South West London Cluster Group, which is 6 boroughs. That then evolved very quickly into the south of London, and now we cover the whole of London. As you can appreciate, we've had to determine an entire new process to deliver the project, the goals and the outcomes, and basically change the construction industry in London. Please note this is only one of our many air quality projects, but it's one of our key ones. It's funded jointly by the GLA through the Mayor's Air Quality Fund with a small contribution from the 33 boroughs. We decided the NRMM label was probably one of the most boring titles, and therefore we changed it and we rebranded to Cleaner Construction London, which is much more less of a mouthful, shall we say. I'm now going to hand over to Lewis and Andrew to go through some of the processes and outcomes, but I'll be available later for some questions and answers.
Hello, sorry, I'm Lewis Bassett. Sorry about the slideshow. I'm juggling the slides and several screens at once. So some of the background to the project. As Jason said, there was a desire to reduce the emissions from construction machinery. This was mainly introduced by the Control of Dust and Emissions from Construction and Demolition SPG that the Mayor of London put out in 2014. So this set the bold new standards for heavily polluting NRMM to try and remove some of the older equipment that had obviously emitting much more PMs and NOx than some of the newer equipment. So we wanted to accelerate the uptake of those newer machines in London from 1st September 2015 onwards. Many local authorities are strapped for cash. They didn't have the resources, nor really the desire, and I don't blame them. It's not easy work to regulate this themselves. It's quite fun work. It's quite muddy work. But if you don't have the staff resourcing to do it, then it is very intensive. So it's evolved into a joint project that's funded mostly by the Mayor of London's Air Quality Fund, and the partnership boroughs also pay match funding yearly to be involved in a project of several £1,000s. So funding was secured back in 2016 to introduce this regulation across 5 boroughs. Merton took the lead in South London, and there was also a North London project that took place at the same time. It quickly grew. It was very popular in the 5 boroughs, very quickly grew to 14 boroughs, and we secured some additional funding to cover those. And we've submitted a bid to continue the project back in 2019 and was successful, and are now covering the whole of London for construction NRMM regulation. We work quite heavily in partnership with the industry, so it's not just a partnership between the boroughs. We also quite like to be a friendly face on site. We don't want to throw the book at people. Generally, if people understand what it is they need to do, they will do it, as long as you ask them in the right way. And that is generally what we're finding with the construction industry. So what are the requirements? It's very similar to the road going equivalent, where at the moment in London, the ULEZ is just being introduced, and all of the cars on the roads need to meet, I believe it's Euro 6. I don't drive, so don't quote me on that. But I think it's very similar to that, where we have emission stages set up that are permitted in certain areas of London. So back when we started in 2015, there was 2 zones. There was the Central Activity Zone Canary Wharf area, which had a slightly increased standard of stage 3B, and everywhere else in London needed to meet emission stage 3A. From 1st September 2020, this jumped up. So this is the current requirement, that stage 3B is now the minimum requirement across the board, but there are elevated zones in and around London where there is a stage 4 minimum. So that is the central activity zone as before, but it is also opportunity areas, which are large areas of brownfield site, and there's lots and lots of development going on. So what we wanted to do is to make sure that we were counteracting the vast number of construction sites in a dense area by introducing the stricter emission standards. From 1st of January 2025, we are hoping to mandate a stage 4 requirement across London, and 2030 this will jump up to stage 5. There's an ambition from the Mayor of London to have 0 emissions from NRMM from 2040. So hopefully by then some of the battery powered technologies will be up and coming and readily available. It's important to note that these don't directly correspond with the road going Euro stages. So a Euro 6 is not necessarily exactly the same standard as a stage 6 in a non-road setting. So we aren't requiring Euro 3 standard, although these machines are typically much more polluting than your typical road vehicle, just because of the size of the engine. The other part of the requirements, there's an administrative side. So sites do have to register all of their site and machinery that's in use on site on the GLA's NRMM portal. This is just a screenshot of that portal and my little test site there. So this helps us identify sites, and we've got the ambition of having a sort of live database. This is all owned by the GLA, by the way, the Mayor's office, not us. But it is hoped to be a live database of all machinery in London. So why bother? It may seem like a silly question in the current air quality climate, but it's important to bring out policies that are actually going to make a significant difference for the cost. This table here is probably a bit too much to digest in the short amount of time I'm going to cover it, but it just gives an idea of predicted emissions from different stages of machinery on a daily and yearly basis. So this is just based on a 5-hour day. Normally the machines are on average operating for about 5 hours across the board as a very, very generic estimate. And you can see that some of the stage ones up the top there are emitting sort of 6 kilograms of NOx a day. And the newer ones have reduced that right down to 258 grams a day approximately. It's all based on emissions limit values, which are available online. And obviously there are problems with defeat strategies, even though they are banned, and the engines will degrade over time. So some of these stage ones will probably actually be worse than this because the engine was made back in 1999. So by swapping one stage 1 out for a stage 4 or 5, you can see you can reduce almost 1.5 ton of NOx a year, and pretty much, what's that, about 98% of the PMs. So there are some really significant potential reductions to be made, and this is all based on the photographed machine there, not that specific one. I'm not saying that JCB have loads of stage 1s out there, but this is the sort of most typical type of machine we see, 130 kilowatt excavator. So I'll hand over to Andrew Gordon to go over some of the more specifics of exactly how we audit sites.
That last slide, Lewis, was fascinating. It's really demonstrating that there's orders of magnitude changes here in what you can achieve by inspecting a machine, such as one of our auditors is doing here. And if necessary, if it's not complying with the mayor zone, swapping it out with something more modern, cleaner, etc. Obviously, the audit process involves initially finding out where the sites are. So the obvious way of doing that could be just to go to the site register. But then if you're doing that, all you're really doing is finding out the sites that are self-declaring. And we'd anticipate them being rather more compliant ones that aren't. So we have to do a lot of actually finding cold engaged sites. And we have learnt right from the earliest days of the South London project that the way to do that is just by having boots on the ground. So if you're going to a site that might have self-declared, you know what to expect, and they've got all kinds of machinery on the record. As you're doing that, it might be in an opportunity area that Lewis has already mentioned. There might be lots of other sites that are developing in a regeneration area. So you might find others that aren't compliant. So we do a lot of that from the street. The online portal is still useful. It gives us immediate contacts. Google Maps is free, which is always good. The flyover has recently happened again over most of London, so it's now quite pertinent data. But even when it was 2016 data, it's still quite useful to see sites that have been cleared that are groundworks areas. Street View is also very useful. We can sometimes identify who is the principal contractor for a given development just from Street View. So Google Maps, a huge asset to us. Local authorities, of course, they're our partners in this. They will give us lists of planning approvals that have gone through, but their actual understanding of what's active on the ground at a given point in time never was good. It got worse, obviously, during the pandemic period, and there is still some legacy very much working remotely. But local authority is another source of data where the concentrations of plants are located. Once we've identified where it is, what is it? So here we've got Jay standing on an excavator, he's on a dumper. He's looking for the engine. So he's going to book an audit. He's going to inspect all the engines that are in scope on site. We're talking about above 37 and below 560, which is most of the yellow things you'll see on the site in and around London. What are the engine stages? In other words, as Lewis has already mentioned, what is the emissions limit value? You also have to find out what the kilowatts are, and then there's a relatively simple arithmetic that you do to work out per kilowatt what the emissions would be. We'll talk about a great deal on that. Is everything compliant with that zone in London? That's what we have to obviously report back to the site. Go to the next slide. Thank you. So is everything registered on the GLA portal correctly? That is a necessary condition of concept of GLA. It encourages systems of governance within the organisations and within the sites to monitor their plants and ensure it's standard. It encourages self-compliance. The register is a very important thing, and we do drive the uptake of that, and we use that as an asset for the plant monitoring within the organisations. We make it useful. So initial findings are generated. They are often including recommendations. So even sites have the best will and intention, they've got very good procedures in place, but what's actually evident on the ground, we've found time and time again, is not necessarily what the developers often some red face. It's a common issue of people in that regard. You know, they thought they had everything in place, but a subcontractor something they weren't expecting, which we're. So it may have to go. Removal from site is one thing we might recommend. We might also recommend registration as something that they neglected to register and should have done. Maybe there's an engine that's orientated in an engine bay in a particular machine in such a way that we can't find the plate. We might use torches, we might use mirrors, we might use fibre optic cameras, all kinds of tools of the trade, but ultimately some plates you just can't find. Not that the engine isn't necessarily compliant, just can't evidence compliance, and as auditors. But there's kinds of supportive documentation I won't go into here that can satisfy us that the engine is compliant if you haven't managed to find the actual engine. We then, after 5 days to enact those recommendations, prepare an outcome sheet. This is the document which is the record as effectively set out in the SPG, not explicitly. The SPG says that sites must have a record of what's on, and this is a capture of that. So alongside the GLA register, the portal, that is the evidencing of what they've got. And finally, we log the data that we've got. So we could have run this project just by looking at emission stages for a given engine and the kilowatts, and that's it. We could have been satisfied with that. But we're naturally curious people. And we took a whole load of other data as well, such as what kind of machine it was, the manufacturer, who was the supplier, what was the engine manufacturer, what area is it in, all kinds of other things, what kind of plates, recognition did it have. And from that, we quickly amassed some very, very useful data, and then fairly quickly realized that that data wasn't just of utility in merely understanding the profile of the London plant, but also going to feed into saving for some time now, and some very interesting results a bit later. So data is a big part now of what we do. What the sites get is something like this. Obviously, you can't see it on screen, the full details, that's not the idea. We've got rows here which are given engines that we've identified. These are with all the characteristics of those engines, kilowatts, emission stage, of course, what kind of identification it have, whether it's compliant, whether it's registered correctly. And then in the box below, we've got recommendations made onto that site. And on the other page, there's 2 pages, normally very succinct, it's designed just to have story in just 2 pages, sometimes 3. It's a standalone story. Is it a compliance fail or not? What were the issues where it failed? And then additional recognition. Sometimes an organisation is going beyond, and it's not reasonable if we're not capturing it. So that's the audit form. But that's not much use for public facing. So we give sites, if they perform well, something they can stick on their external face, if you like. They can put it on the hoarding of their site. They can use it in their stakeholder engagement with neighbours. They can also, most importantly, incorporate it into their environmental portfolio. So most of the organisations we come into contact with, they have published environmental strategies, and they're usually having some difficulty in actually achieving the objectives against. This is again something they can use to evidence of doing so, help them with tendering. So that's certificates, good, excellent, or just don't get one. And then we're just starting to roll out now certification for the sites themselves to go high up on construction. You see top right there, great big banner, is a very large site. We will start to see those banners hopefully quite soon. In the early stages of the South London project, people didn't know who we were. They didn't know what NRMM was. The signposting was not as it might have been. Yes, the SPG existed, supplementary planning guidance, but it was not readily visible to your typical site operator. So very quickly we recognised the need of a practical guide doing exactly what it said in the tin, what a site manager needs to do to achieve compliance with the Mayor of London's low emission zone. That's gone through many iterations. We're now on version 5, which hopefully will be coming out in a month or so. These are partly to make clearer the scenario as the emissions standards increase in London, partly to signpost the future. Very long lead times here for project. We also do presentations such as this, of course. We also do training to organisations. That might be spontaneously an organisation reaching out to us saying, look, we want to get excellent outcomes every time. Can you help us? And of course, we're funded by the Mayor, funded by the RS for match funding. So we can do that free of charge training for consultants, if you like. Other times we'll identify an organisation that really isn't performing very well, and so we'll suggest to them to have some training for the site. Advisors. The suppliers had a bit of a bitter pill with all this, of course. If you have a large fleet and you find, well, some of them didn't realise until we engaged them, that there's some of those items they can't deploy in London, but deploy in certain areas. So we do work with them so that they are better signposted. We do the best we can. There's only 6 of us, but we do what we can. Proactively reaching out to them, making sure that the upgrade of their fleet is to a future standard as far as is possible. This involves also working with industry associations. We're doing lots with Construction Equipment Association and other organisations that are representing the trade. We also, of course, have a very large number of high interest stakeholders, the boroughs, 33 of them, of course. They all need reporting, annual and fiscal reporting of what we're doing on their ground. Trade shows, reaching out to the engine manufacturers. First one of these we went to, we were stunned really that the engine manufacturers weren't aware of this emergent market in London. So again, we were signposted to reassure them that things like generator upgrades in standard, they actually were going to take place and they were going to be enforced and we were going to be driving the uptake of the products. So a lot of what we do is enabling innovative technology to compete with extant fleet. Otherwise it's not going to, because it's obviously cheaper to keep the kit you've got. So Lewis, can you let us know something about the outputs and outcomes as we've derived them? Thank you.
Yes, so just to give you some stats, this data was all put together in March 2021. We haven't had a chance to revisit it yet, but these numbers will have gone up slightly. But as of March 2021, we had audited 1,876 sites. So it will probably be just over 2,000 by now, I would have hoped, and 5,664 machines over the 6 years since we started back in 2016. So the machines will probably be over 6,000 by now as well. We typically see 89% compliance. So that is that all the machinery is registered and it meets the required emission standards. This is after we've visited. So Andrew mentioned we have a 5-day audit period. So we turn up, we give recommendations if needed for anything that we've identified as non-compliant or needs to be registered. They then get 5 days to enact that recommendation, and then that is their final outcome after those 5 days. So 89% compliance after that process. And this was without a single legal notice being served. So as mentioned earlier as well, that typically sites are very cooperative. Also, a lot of that 10% is just where sites have been caught out and hadn't heard of the requirements before. And that is sort of what we're here to do anyway, to raise the awareness on the ground. So that's not to say that 10% of people have told us to get lost. They haven't. 37% before audit. So when we first turn up on the site, we only see 37% compliance. So that just goes to show that, that our activity actually increases. Just that 5-day period where we work with the site and help them massively increases the compliance rates. This is up from an industry standard of just 28%. So when we started back in 2016, when we was first turning up on site, only 28% of sites were compliant. And during that first project, we had a 68% compliance rate after the audit. So things are progressing. Compliance as a whole has gone up, 20%. And self-compliance has gone up by about 10% as well. And from these changes over time, we've calculated the emissions that we've saved. So that table on the right there just shows the different engine stages that there are out there and the percentage of machinery that fell into each of those categories that we had inspected. So the industry baseline is when we started back in 2016, when we first turned up on the site. And then we've got March 2019 values there, which was the end of our sort of first South London phase of the project. And you can see that already the stage 1s, 2s and 3As have started to drop. Bearing in mind, stage 3A was actually still allowed in most of London back then. So people were forward planning. March 21, it further improves and we start to see a much larger uptake of the stage 4 and stage 5 just came out in 2020, so there weren't any before then, but the stage 4 definitely took a big jump between 2019 and 21, and that is obviously because of the standard jumping up into September 2020. Everyone needed to upgrade in the central activity zones and opportunity areas to stage 4. So how do we calculate our emission saved values? We've tried to keep it simple for two reasons. One, because we just don't have the data to do the detailed analysis of load bearing on machines. Operational hours has to be estimated, as we don't have sort of accurate data for that. Though our guesswork, seeing as we've inspected 2,000 machines and 6,000 sites, is pretty good, and we have had we have run this by several suppliers and had the emissions model peer reviewed. We focus on how much pollution has been avoided. So looking back at what we were seeing back in 2016, what would have happened if we never existed and we had just allowed people to continue using all the machinery they already had? Obviously, people upgrade their machines for various different reasons, not just our activity. The machines break. Some companies like to update their machinery regularly anyway. We are trying to take that into account in the next rerun of the model, which is in March 2022. So we should have we have had recommendations back from the peer review that says it's fit for purpose, but there's a few areas to improve, and we're making improvements there, and we should have a more accurate value by March 2022. It's quite simple. The emissions limit values that I keep going on about, we multiply those out by kilowatts and by the hours that the machine that we average that the machine is running. So the emission limit values are actually given in grams per kilowatt hour. Multiplying out by kilowatts and hours gives you grams. We then look at the difference between the total amount of PM and the total amount of NOx from the two different scenarios. So the scenario of if everyone was allowed to continue using the machinery they already had, and what we actually found in field, and that is the emission savings for PM and NOx. The CO2 calculations are based on the findings of a study by D'Souza et al. At Imperial College, who done some actual real-world testing on these engines rather than just using the modelled emission limit values, and they found average amounts of CO2 that are emitted from certain stages of machinery. And they published that in grams per kilowatt hour as well. So all we've done for the CO2 values is take those grams per kilowatt hour and treat them as if they are the emissions limit values for CO2. Value for money. Although, yeah, it shouldn't really matter how much it costs to improve the air quality and environment. You don't want to be throwing money away. So far, the table here shows how much money we have spent at each point in the project. It's projected for March 2022, by which time both projects combined will have cost a total of £1.7 million to run. This is associated with hundreds of tons of savings. So the PM is 67 ton is fairly impressive in itself. If you imagine 67 ton of soot. The NOx saved, much more impressive, 1,310 ton, and an even more impressive CO2 saving of over 100,000 tons. As I say, the model is undergoing some tweaks and changes, so these values may vary slightly. We don't expect any significant changes to the values. And when you compare this to the atmospheric emissions inventory of 2016, this is a yearly average reduction of around 11% of CO2 from the entire industry, 7% of NOx from the entire industry, and 0.3% of PM from the entire industry. Obviously, PM in the construction industry is heavily dominated by dust. So there's still some way to go. 11% is nice, but it's by no means a resolution to the entire problem. And we're currently looking into ways of introducing dust management and sustainability initiatives into our processes as well, pending resourcing for that. DEFRA also published a tool for calculating the public health benefit, which we have plugged our values into. Their tool works on a yearly basis. We're comparing in a before and after scenario, so we don't have year-on-year savings, so we've just split them evenly just so that you know how we've calculated it. And this is what their model throws up. So the low sensitivity value there of 717,000 impossible public health savings, but a more likely value of 7.6 million so way more than the project actually costs. And for PM 2.5, similar story, just over 3 million likely, but possibly as low as 651,000. So using this tool, we estimate that at worst the project has almost paid for itself. And this isn't the point of the project. We're not selling the project as a "this will save you money" campaign. That's not really the point. It's about saving emissions. But as a side note, it is possible that these projects are at least paying for themselves, if not better. But just because of the benefits associated with the amount of emissions that are saved. So central values suggest it's quite likely, with the PM and the NOx values combined, to have saved possibly in the region of £10.7 million of the public purse. And the higher values indicate that it could possibly be as much as 37.8 million, which would be extraordinary. So there's good savings to be made as well. So back over to Andrew briefly to go over lessons learned.
It's going to be super brief, Lewis, because I'm so cognizant of time, so I'm going to fly through these, probably even abandon some of these slides. I want to just say very, very quickly, the industry has been so supportive, isn't really the right word. They've recognised that we are enabling them to achieve their environmental objectives, and we're a very, very clear conduit for that. So I think in the early days, I for one, I think the whole project team were anticipating a typical regulatory engagement where you escalate your enforcement as you go, starting soft and then making reference to some sort of carrot, some sort of stick. In fact, of course, we haven't got a stick. There is no act we can make reference to in this context. It didn't seem to matter. We managed to engage with the industry. They were on board. Everyone's going in the same direction. What we're effectively doing is raising the environmental agenda in a given construction project that can compete with other factors, such as completion time and money and things like that. So it was more cooperative with industry than we certainly had. It's fundamentally very, very simple. That's true. And the minutiae of it gets unbelievably complex, but it's a very straightforward way to improve air quality. I think the next slide, Lewis, will have. Yeah, so we didn't need, as we thought we would do, a complete sort of a devastating enforcement action. There isn't any recourse to anything beyond breach of a planning condition technique. That hasn't happened, in that we're not aware of anyone having taken action against the site. That hasn't managed to be part of our mission zone. So we haven't yet needed it. We will ultimately need it, and we are campaigning for that to exist. Hopefully it'll be something in the new Environment Act or something similar that will formally enshrine this, and that will again enable us to really push this agenda further. Thank you. And again. So we obviously have things to feed back to the sponsor, the GLA, and things to feed back into our own operations. So we're meeting advisors a lot, taking their advice. We're also using anonymous feedback forms to the closing of our audits, and they're very, very helpful. So it's always been a very agile project, always been a very dynamic project, and it continues. Trouble is, we are ending in spring next year. So we are seeking additional funding to continue. It's obvious that we need to continue. Not just in London, I think there's a need to look outside London. We know it's scalable because we've done it once already. We know the model can be really applied to any metropolitan centre. It is a neighbourhood air quality issue. And there are so many air quality action plans that need something like this, I think, incorporated in. All you need to do is to create this. As I say, we're ending. We've got a lot more to do in London. We know from looking at our data that if we don't visit a site for 10 months or so, tend to slip back. So we don't need to guess. We know for a fact that if on the ground enforcement activity ends, this thing will fold in and it's going to be. Jason, have you got anything to add to that?
No, I think I'd probably just add apologies. Firstly, my camera seems to not be working at the moment, but I think what we need to recognise is the amount of effort that's gone into this. We've had to build an entirely new framework. The industry have bought into this right from the beginning. They're willing and happy to do something about air quality, but what they want is a level playing field, and they want to know what to do. So I think this originally was sort of coached as an enforcement program, and everybody, the questions usually come up about what do you do if they don't do this, but we've found that there's such a desire to do something, and it is about that awareness raising. So for me, I think to lose this project from 2022 onwards would be terrible. I think it's one of the projects that's delivered probably the biggest air quality savings outside the low emission zone in London. And also we have a product that we can pick up and drop in any city in the UK. So we have all the procedures, all the processes in place. So I would like to see it extended and expanded, but obviously we are reliant on funding. So I think that's it from me.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Andrew, Lewis, and Jason, for presenting that. We're just going to look at some questions now. So Alan McDonald has said, what is the percentage contribution of emissions from this sector when compared to total emissions? Will these reductions make a significant reduction in concentrations?
Yes, so the London Atmospheric Emissions Inventory is again where we get that information from. The construction is the third largest contributor of air, I think it's both air quality and sustainability in London. The latest figures are still from 2016. They're due to be updated soon. I think the atmospheric emissions inventory is undergoing some updates as we speak. But the latest values are 7% of NOx, 14% of PM10, and I think 8% of PM2.5 in London. So it is 10% of 10%. That said, it's still large numbers, and I would say that once, as all of the pollution in London is dropping, especially on road, then the percentage contribution from other industries is going to get proportionately larger. So sorry, I've got an echo. So yes, it's 10% of about 14%, which we need more significant than that, and hopefully we can, by expanding the project, we can actually increase that even more. But that's not to take away from the fact that hundreds of tons of savings over 6 years isn't impressive on its own as well.
I think what I'd like to add to that as well is that these are generalised figures over London. What you have are construction sites that are in specific locations for sometimes years at a time. So the impact on those local communities is going to be much higher than it is reflected in some general statistics across London.
Thank you, Lewis and Jason. So next question is by Sarah. And she says, thanks for the interesting presentations. I've come across a number of non-London LAs using the Mayor's construction standard as planning conditions. Have you heard of LAs outside London following your approach for audits? And what are you doing to share experience?
I'll share with anyone. I'm not aware of anyone who's actually reached out to us to actually implement something. We've had soft expressions of interest, of course. A lot of metropolitan centres can see what we can deliver for them. Has anyone actually worked with us hitherto? No. At the moment, we're focusing on London, of course, completing this project, but we are very aware that we can assist other cities. So it's something we're going to be more active in, I think, as we move towards 2022, is reaching out actively, but we are receptive to any cities that want to create a low emissions zone.
Just to add to that, Andrew, I think we are in discussions with DEFRA. Obviously, it's early stages for us, but we would like to see it expanded. And if there are any authorities that want to come to us for advice or information, perhaps adopt our approaches, we're more than happy to help them.
So thank you, guys. Next question is by Daniel Marsh, and he says, have DEFRA expressed an interest in the project learnings so far, and how to integrate this into the current UK policy being developed for NRMM emission control?
I think Jason just answered that pretty much. Very early stages. They're aware we've got some real world experience of this. They're aware it's transferable. We've got a lot more work to do, I think, with DEFRA in the coming year, and probably beyond that. So yes, we are in comms with them on that.
And So Bruno asks, it's good to hear that construction companies are supporting this project and generally complying despite the lack of enforcement powers. Have you been engaging with the suppliers who provide equipment? And also, is there anything you can say about the change necessary in equipment standards? I know, for example, that it is difficult to obtain compliant generators.
It certainly is a real problem for us. It was, of course, COVID, as it was for everyone, but in particular context, the supply chain was disrupted radically. So we expected at a given date there to be a fleet of stage 5s available by the date which the GLA had set, September 2020. That was impossible. So a viability exemption was granted for that particular scenario. So there's quite a lot of questions there. What was the other question? Do you want to know about the emission standards? Lewis, do you want to plug in on the standards and what they are exactly? Other than, was that the nature of the question?
Yeah, so it was of suppliers. We do engage with suppliers just naturally through the audit process anyway. Quite often when we require something to be removed, especially if the supplier didn't know about it previously, it does kick up a bit of a fuss on site naturally. And so we do work with them, and they often come to us with questions on, are there any retrofits available for our machines so we can clip on some exhaust systems, particularly for expensive machinery. The emission sort of standards are pretty much as high as they can be for what's available in the London fleet. So as far as they ask for, how much of an improvement needs to be made, well, that's all dependent on the availability in the London fleet and the manufacturers that provide that machinery. At the moment, for the demand of within the opportunity areas and the central zone for stage 4 and 3B everywhere else, it's very difficult for us to ask for more than what we already are. Generators are a special case where they haven't been manufactured to stages 3B or 4, so that has jumped up from a stage 3A to a stage 5. COVID's hit as well, Brexit's hit as well, so there has been a delay in getting those stage 5 machines out there, particularly with AdBlue management with the larger generators. And we have a similar, albeit not quite a severe problem, with smaller machinery at stages 3B. So below 56 kilowatts, stage 4 doesn't exist. So again, we have to jump up to stage 5. The supply of stage 5, because of COVID and Brexit, is still limited, and more limited than we expected it to be. So there are viability exemptions available on a case-by-case basis. They do have to provide strong evidence for those exemptions to say that they have sought out the machinery and it is not available out there. It isn't just saying, oh, we can't get it, and we sign it off.
Great answer, guys. Thank you. So Adam says, we're pushing supply chains to improve fleets and meet these standards, which is excellent. Has any thought gone into what happens with old machinery, i.e. reuse or recycling?
We don't know, other than they probably leave London. They almost certainly leave London. Depends on where we found them. We found them in an opportunity area or central activity zone where there's an enhanced standard, then they'll just be deployed elsewhere, London, of course. If they can't be used anywhere in Greater London, most plant that we encounter tends to come from a hinterland, sort of radially out from London, but will just go out to other cities, other sites elsewhere. That has a bearing, of course, on what we do in terms of overall air quality globally. What's we're doing. Our perspective very much always has been neighbourhood air quality. As Jason's already mentioned, we're concerned about concentration of high numbers of kilowatts of dirty engines, often in regeneration areas, often where there's disequity in who those immediate residents are. And what we're going on really 5 years, some of these opportunity areas, areas of deprivation to an extent, many examples of that. And yeah, these are long-standing redevelopment projects. We need to protect those residents, certainly. And yes, we are displacing it, but hopefully displacing those engines to more dispersed environments. Some of them we know are going to, of course, lead to decay. And again, that has its own issues associated with it. But we have to have a perspective. 6 of us here, our perspective at the moment is London. It's given zones, given areas.
Thanks, Andrew. So Rosie asks, any advice on how we can on-site demonstrate improvements in NRMM emissions when it is a combination of diesel alternatives and improved stages?
This is probably for you, Lewis. Are you happy answering this one, or should I go for it?
Yep, can do. Is that sorry, just the first part of that question again? Is it sounds like is that asking about sort of combinations of having sort of hybrids on sites and alternative fuels and that as well, and incorporating that into the audit process?
I believe so. It says any advice on how we can on-site demonstrate improvements in NRMM emissions when it is a combination of
site-specific modelling, Lewis, I think,
yep.
is the question.
Yeah, absolutely. So the emission limit values are available online. There is lots of emerging research into real-world emissions from NRMM. Quite a lot of it coming out of Imperial College. So there is research available to help you to come up with your own site-specific models. It is something that we want to do. It is a nice to have for the project, though it is not part of the KPIs. We will desperately try to get something out before March 2022, but can't promise anything. But yes, and by all means incorporate your hybrid technology as well, and all of the other things that we're trialing. Battery powered technology is emerging, so in a limited number of settings there is fully electric machinery available. And yes, have a holistic approach to doing this. Definitely includes, as all of the other air quality areas that you can. We are very much focused on diesel NRMM, but that is by no means the only area that you can make improvements. And I'd also refer you over to the COCP, Construction Code of Practice, which we are also currently going through fine tuning with the GLA, and should hopefully be available online soon. And that gives some of the other areas as well, the dust control and the sustainability. So yes, you can demonstrate this, and we were going to try and standardize that for you, but yeah, we can't promise it just yet.
So I'm just going to ask one last quick question. So it says, Anonymous says, what will happen to the 2025, 2030 and 2040 plans if funding isn't achieved beyond 2022?
Yeah, someone's going to have to signpost the industry. Yeah, not us, it's going to have to be someone else. But long lead times for these projects, people are already speccing for those dates now. So yeah, it's going to be a difficult job without people actively engaging the sites and engaging the organisations. It's all very well to be passive and say, oh, the information is published, but it does need active outreach. It does need actually someone at the site gate saying, hello, I need just environmental manager, or site manager, or portfolio manager.
I think to add to that, Andrew, we are trying to mitigate that simply by trying to attract some further funding to carry this beyond 22 and hopefully expand it. So we're hoping that's not going to happen, and we're hoping we're going to be there. But obviously, these projects are time limited.
Thank you all so much for presenting. That was a really interesting webinar. That's it from us today. Attendees, thank you so much for logging in. I hope that you found this really beneficial and informative. Don't forget to record your attendance at this webinar in the IES CPD tool, and you can do this by logging into the members area. This webinar has been recorded and will be available on the IES website and YouTube channel. If you're watching the recording on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel, like the video, and hit the bell to gain notification of new content. Thank you so much for everyone who attended. Thank you, Jason, Andrew, and Lewis.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.